The letter burned in Charlotte Rourke's hand like a coal pulled from the fire. She had found it tucked beneath the loose floorboard in the study, the one she had tripped over twice in her first week at the Broken Spur Ranch, and had simply learned to step around. She had not been snooping. She had been looking for the spare ink bottle Timothy had mentioned was stored somewhere in the room. But the folded paper had caught her eye because her own name was written on the front of it, in Timothy Warren's careful, deliberate hand, and the date at the top was 3 weeks old. She had come to Laramie, Wyoming, in the spring of 1882 as a temporary schoolteacher, hired for one season to fill in while the town's regular teacher, a woman named Agnes Fitch, recovered from a broken leg sustained in a runaway wagon accident. Charlotte had been very clear about the arrangement when she accepted the position. One season. She had debts to settle in Denver, a mother she intended to return to, a life that was waiting for her 400 miles south like a patient dog at a gate. She had been clear. But Timothy Warren, it turned out, had not been listening to the word temporary at all. The letter was not addressed to her. It was addressed to a man named Gerald Holt, the land broker in Cheyenne who had sold Timothy this very ranch 4 years ago. And what it said, written in that same careful hand that she had come to find deeply, unreasonably comforting over the past 3 months, was this: I am writing to inquire about the adjacent parcel, the 40 acres that border my eastern fence line, the ones with the creek running through them. I know we spoke of the asking price last autumn, and I told you I had no use for more land. I am writing to say that I have a use for it now. The creek plot has a natural basin that would support a kitchen garden of considerable size, and there is a flat clearing among the cottonwoods that would make an ideal spot for a second structure, a cottage of modest size, something a woman might find charming rather than merely functional. I intend to break ground in the summer. Please advise on the earliest date we might finalize the purchase. She read it twice, standing in the middle of the study with the late afternoon light coming in sideways through the dusty window, painting everything amber and gold. A cottage, a kitchen garden, something a woman might find charming. She had told him she was leaving at the end of June. She had said it plainly, and he had nodded and gone back to whatever he was doing, and she had assumed he understood. And all the while he had been writing letters to land brokers and making plans that stretched past June into summer and beyond. Plans that were built entirely around the idea that she would still be here to occupy a cottage among the cottonwoods. The betrayal of it hit her first, hot and sharp, because she had not asked for this. She had not asked for Timothy Warren and his quiet ways and his ridiculously capable hands, and the way he always knew when to pour a second cup of coffee without being told. She had not asked for any of it. And now he had gone and built a future around her without once having the courage to tell her about it, without once asking whether it was what she wanted, and she felt trapped in the most infuriating and confusing way possible, because the part of her that was angry was nearly equal in size to the part that was moved. She set the letter down on the desk and walked out of the study, and stood in the hallway with her hand pressed flat against the cool plaster wall, trying to breathe. 3 months ago, Charlotte Rourke had arrived at the Laramie train depot on a morning so cold that her breath came out in solid white clouds, and the wagon wheel tracks in the mud were frozen solid, and she had looked at the wide, treeless expanse of territory stretching in every direction and thought, well, it is only a season. She had arranged the lodging herself, writing in advance to the schoolhouse board, and they had placed her with a widow woman on the edge of town named Mrs. Alderhoff, who kept a tidy room and served an excellent supper, but who snored through the thin wall with a volume that Charlotte could only describe as agricultural. After 2 weeks of this, one of the board members, a red-faced man named Deacon Foss, had mentioned almost apologetically that Timothy Warren, whose ranch sat 3 miles south of town, had a spare room and had offered it to the school board for the teachers' use, free of charge as a kind of community contribution. He was a quiet fellow, Deacon Foss said, kept to himself. honest as the day was long. His late wife had loved the schoolhouse, apparently. Charlotte had accepted, partly because she was genuinely exhausted, and partly because Mrs. Alderhoff's snoring had begun to feel like a personal attack. She had expected the ranch to be rough. She had expected a spare room to mean a cot in a storage space with a nail in the wall for her coat. Instead, she had walked through the door of the Broken Spur and found a house that was spare in the way that only deliberate, thoughtful people make things spare. Every item in it chosen and placed with care. The walls clean, the floors swept. A real wool rug in the main room. Bookshelves built right into the wall beside the fireplace. Actual books on them. The spare room had a real bed and a window that faced east so the morning light came in warm and gentle. And there was a small writing desk beneath the window that she later discovered Timothy had carried up from the barn and refinished himself in the weeks before her arrival, because the board had mentioned she was a teacher, and he assumed she would want a place to work. She had stood in the doorway of that room for a long moment before setting down her trunk. He was not what she had expected either. She had imagined someone older, more weathered, more thoroughly beaten into silence by the land and the work. Timothy Warren was 31 years old, which was only 4 years ahead of her own 27, and while he was certainly weathered, lean and sun-dark and carrying the kind of quiet that comes from years of working alone, he was not beaten by it. He seemed, as best she could tell in those first confusing days, to be at genuine peace with his own company, which made her presence in his house feel less like an intrusion and more like something he was simply, calmly, making room for. He had shown her around the ranch on her second morning, walking at a pace that accommodated her rather than his own long stride, pointing out the well and the woodpile and the root cellar and the small barn where his 2 horses, a dun mare named Patience and a larger bay gelding named Rough, stood watching them with an air of supreme indifference. He had explained the household's rhythms without telling her she needed to conform to them, had asked whether she preferred her coffee strong or mild, and had listened when she answered. He had not hovered. He had not treated her as a curiosity or a problem to be managed. He had simply, with very little fuss, made space for her existence and gone on with his own. She had found this maddening in a way she could not immediately explain. Charlotte had grown up in Denver, had spent 4 years teaching at a city school before the restlessness took hold, and she had worked in 2 other temporary placements before this one, both times in small towns, both times with ranch families who had hosted her with varying degrees of awkward formality or unwanted scrutiny. She knew how to be a guest who did not impose, knew how to keep herself contained and separate, and temporarithos were the skills of the traveling teacher. But Timothy Warren did not seem to need her to be contained. He set a place for her at the table every morning and every evening without comment. He built up the fire in the main room on cold nights, and then sat reading on one side of it while she graded papers on the other. And the silence between them was not the silence of 2 strangers tolerating each other's proximity, but something else, something that took her nearly a full month to recognize. It was comfortable. She had been disturbed by this. She had thrown herself into the school with a ferocity that was partly genuine love of teaching and partly deliberate strategy, arriving early and staying late, planning elaborate lessons and decorating the chalkboard with careful illustrations, learning every child's name and their particular troubles within the first week. There were 22 children in her classroom, ranging from 6 to 14, and they presented her with the full range of challenges that a mixed-age frontier school could offer. The 6-year-old boy named Peter who wept without warning for reasons no one had yet determined. The 12-year-old Calloway twins who had developed an entire private language of blinks and finger taps that they used to cheat on spelling tests. The 14-year-old girl named Rosa Mendez, who was genuinely brilliant and bored, and needed more than Charlotte could probably give her with the materials available. She loved them all with the quick, fierce, temporary love of the traveling teacher, the kind that was given fully and then given up when the season ended. That was the arrangement. That had always been the arrangement. In April, a late snowstorm hit Laramie with unexpected savagery, 3 feet of new snow falling in 2 days, and the road into town became impassable. Charlotte was stranded at the broken spur for 4 days, the schoolhouse closed, the whole white world reduced to the space between the barn and the house. She had expected the forced proximity to be unbearable. Timothy had apparently expected the same thing, because on the morning of the first full day, he had come in from tending the horses with snow on his hat brim, and immediately set about moving the kitchen table to give her more working space, as if creating room for her even in a confinement was his first instinct. They had played cards on the second day, because she had found a worn deck in the drawer beside the fireplace, and had held it up questioningly, and he had said he supposed they could. He played with a quiet competence that she found genuinely irritating, winning 3 hands of rummy to her one, before she accused him, half seriously, of hiding cards in his sleeve. He had looked down at his sleeve and then back at her and said, with absolutely no change of expression, that he would not know where else to keep them, and she had laughed before she could stop herself, a real laugh, the kind that startled the room. He had looked at her then, just briefly, with something in his face that she recognized but deliberately did not name. On the 3rd day of the snowstorm, she had asked him about his late wife. She was not sure why she asked. Her name had been Ellen. She knew that much from Deacon Foss's brief mention of her, and the evidence of a woman's prior presence in the house was subtle but present. A particular pattern to the kitchen shelves, a faded curtain at the parlor window that matched nothing else in the room but had clearly been left exactly where it hung. Timothy had been quiet for a long time after she asked, long enough that she thought he might not answer, and then he had said that Ellen had died in the winter of 1879 of a fever that had come on fast and not let go, and that she had been 26 years old, and that she had been the one who planted the 3 cottonwood saplings along the eastern fence, because she believed the property needed something that would grow tall and give shade and be there long after both of them were gone. Charlotte had said she was sorry and meant it entirely. He had nodded and gone back to his book, but before he looked down at the page he said, without particular emphasis, that he thought Ellen would have liked Charlotte's classroom. He had stopped in to look at it once, the week before school opened, when the board had asked him to check the stovepipe for damage after a summer windstorm. He had seen the way she had arranged it. He thought Ellen, who had believed strongly in the importance of children learning to love learning, would have appreciated it. Charlotte had not known what to do with that. She had sat with it for several hours, and then decided it was simply a kind thing said by a kind man, and that she was assigning it too much weight, because she had been alone with this kind man in a snowstorm for 3 days, and her judgment was compromised by proximity. Then the snow melted and she went back to the classroom and recalibrated and went on as before, except that things were not exactly as before, because now when she came home in the evenings, she noticed small things. The way he looked up from his work when she came through the door, not obtrusively, not in a way that demanded attention, but in the way of someone for whom a familiar sound had become a thing they listened for. The way he had begun leaving a lantern lit in the hallway when he went to bed before she finished her grading. The evening he had come home from town with a copy of a book she had mentioned in passing, 2 weeks before, that she had always meant to read. He had set it on the kitchen table beside her coffee cup without a word, as if delivering a piece of mail. She had sat looking at the book for nearly 5 minutes before she picked it up. In May, the spring work on the ranch intensified, and she began to understand, in a way she had not fully grasped before, what it meant to run a cattle operation largely alone. Timothy had 2 ranch hands who came in during the busiest weeks, brothers named Cal and Ned Prout, lean young men from somewhere in Missouri who worked hard and ate a great deal, and treated Charlotte with the somewhat formal deference of people who had been told by their employer to mind their manners. But the weight of the operation rested squarely on Timothy's own shoulders, and she watched him carry it with a steadiness that she found, against all her best intentions, deeply admirable. She started helping with small things, not because anyone asked her to. She simply found herself doing it, setting the table because she was already in the kitchen, bringing water from the well because she was going out anyway, feeding the chickens in the early morning because she was awake and they were noisy, and it took 10 minutes. Timothy noticed and said nothing about it, which she came to understand was his particular form of gratitude, the not making a thing of it, which was itself a form of respect. She started looking forward to supper in a way that she recognized as dangerous. There was an evening in late May when a spring thunderstorm rolled through, and the lightning was spectacular, great branching white trees of it shattering the sky every few seconds. And Timothy had come out to the porch where she was standing watching it, because she had been unable to stay inside. The display was too extraordinary. He had stood beside her for a long time without speaking, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cool, storm-washed air. And at one point, a particularly violent crack of thunder had startled her backward a half step, and his hand had come up automatically, steady and certain, and caught her elbow. And she had not moved away from it, and neither had he, and they had stood like that for another 10 minutes while the storm emptied itself over the dark Wyoming plain. That was when she had known she was in real trouble. She had written to her mother in Denver that weekend, a carefully casual letter about the children in her class and the scenery and the particulars of life on the frontier, with no mention whatsoever of Timothy Warren's hand on her elbow in the storm. And now it was the second week of June, with less than 3 weeks remaining until the end of her contract, and she was standing in the hallway of his house with her palm flat against the plaster wall and his secret letter burning on the desk in the study behind her. She waited until supper. She waited all through the meal, watching him across the table, watching the way he passed the bread without being asked and refilled her water glass and asked about her day with the specific, genuine curiosity that she had stopped being able to take for granted weeks ago. She waited until the plates were cleared and the evening quiet had settled into the kitchen, and then she got up and went to the study and retrieved the letter and came back and set it on the table in front of him. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. Not with the expression of a man caught in a trap, which was what she had somewhat expected, but with an expression of quiet, unflinching honesty that made her throat tighten. He said, "I was going to tell you." She said, "When?" He said, "I was trying to find the right time." She sat back down across from him and pressed her hands flat on the table, the same gesture she used when she needed to be very clear with a student. She said, "Timothy, I told you at the beginning that I was only here for the season. I have a life in Denver. I have obligations. You knew this." He said, "Yes," she said, "and yet you have been writing to land brokers about cottages." He said, "Yes." Said, "You have been planning for a future that you have not bothered to mention to the person who would apparently be living in it." He said, "I know, that was wrong of me." He paused. He was looking at the letter, not at her, and she could see him choosing his words with the careful deliberateness of a man who did not say things he did not mean. Then he looked up and he said, "I was afraid. If I told you, you might go sooner." The room was very quiet. Outside, a night bird called once and fell silent. Charlotte looked at this man who had quietly been building a world around her existence without ever asking her if she wanted to live in it. And she felt every complicated thing she had been refusing to feel for 3 months pressing up against the inside of her ribs all at once. The warmth of it and the fear of it and the absolute inconvenience of it. Because she had plans, she had a life. She had a mother in Denver who was waiting for her. She said, carefully, "Tell me now. Tell me what you were planning." He told her. He told her quietly and without performance, in the same direct way he did everything, looking at her across the kitchen table with the lamp burning low between them and the Wyoming night spread out dark and immense beyond the windows. He told her that in the 3 months she had been in his house, he had grown accustomed to her in a way that he had not expected and could not now undo, that she had changed the character of the place simply by being in it, not in any dramatic or disruptive way, but in the way that light changes when it comes through a different window. He told her about the 40 acres with the creek running through them, the cottonwood clearing where Ellen had always wanted a garden, but they had never gotten to it because there was always the more pressing work of the cattle. He told her that he had written to Gerald Holt because he had found himself thinking about the spring, not just this spring but the next one, and thinking about her being in it. He did not tell her he loved her. He was not the kind of man who would have led with that, she understood. But everything he said was love, in the vocabulary of a man who expressed himself in action and presence, and in the patient, hopeful preparation of a garden plot that did not yet exist. When he was finished, she said nothing for a long time. Then she said, "My mother, in Denver, she is not well. She has not been well for 2 years. It is part of why I needed the income from this placement and part of why I intend to go back because she needs me closer." He said, "I understand." She said, "Do you?" He said, "I understand that it is a real thing and not an excuse and that it matters." She said, "Then you understand why I cannot simply stay because there is a letter to a land broker." He said, "Yes." She said, "What I do not understand is why you did not talk to me about any of this instead of writing secret letters." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, "Because I was not ready for the answer to be no." Charlotte stood up from the table. She needed to move, needed to not be sitting across from him with the lamplight on his face looking exactly as honest and steadfast as he always looked, because it was making it very difficult to think. She went to the window and looked out at the dark yard and the outline of the barn, and the 3 cottonwood trees along the eastern fence that Ellen had planted, and that had grown, in the 3 years since her death, into something tall and real and present. She said, still facing the window, "If you had asked me in March whether I wanted to stay, I would have said no. I came here for a season, I would have said. That is all, I have my own life." He said nothing. She said, "If you asked me that same question tonight, I do not know what I would say." A long silence. Then from behind her, his voice, even and careful and containing something that was unmistakably hope. "What would help you know?" She turned from the window and looked at him. She said, "I need to go to Denver. I need to see my mother and understand what she actually needs, and whether what she needs could be arranged differently than I have imagined." She paused. "And you need to stop making plans about my life without including me in them." He said, "That is fair," she said. "If I come back, it will be my choice, not because you have built something and I am simply expected to walk into it." He said, "If you come back, I will ask you every step of the way." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I am not promising anything." He said, "I know." She said, "I am going to finish the school term, and then I am going to Denver. And after that I cannot tell you what happens." He said, "That is all right." She went to bed that night with her thoughts running so fast and hot that sleep seemed entirely hypothetical. And she lay in the east-facing room with the Wyoming darkness outside the window and her heart doing something complicated and unwelcome in her chest. And she thought about the letter and the cottage and the cottonwood clearing and a man who had been afraid of the word no, and had therefore simply not asked the question. And she thought, against all her careful planning, about spring and how it always came whether you were ready for it or not. The remaining 3 weeks of the school term were different from what had come before. There was a new understanding between them, neither easy nor entirely comfortable, but real in the way that only honesty can make things real. Timothy had stopped pretending that his plans were invisible. She had stopped pretending that her feelings were simpler than they were. They moved through the house with a new kind of careful awareness of each other, like 2 people who had acknowledged aloud that the room they were standing in was on fire and had chosen together to first finish the conversation before addressing the flames. He rode into town with her some mornings, not every morning, but enough that it became a thing that happened. The 2 of them on the road in the early light with the dew still on the grass, and the sky going through its daily performance of impossible colors above the high plain. He rode rough, the bay, and she had learned to sit Patience the dun mare well enough over the past months that she no longer felt like a liability on horseback, and they would ride in a companionable quiet that was full of things they were not yet saying. One morning, about 10 days before the end of term, he said, without preamble, "Tell me about your mother." She told him. Her mother's name was Frances Rourke, née Callahan, and she had been strong and capable for most of Charlotte's life. A woman who had run a boarding house after Charlotte's father died, who had managed money and difficult guests, and a leaking roof with equal practical energy. But 2 years ago her heart had begun to fail her in the literal sense, and the boarding house had become too much, and Charlotte's brother Michael had taken her in, which was good because Michael was kind. But Michael's wife, Deborah, was a woman of limited warmth and had made it quietly but comprehensively clear that the arrangement was temporary. Timothy listened to all of this without interruption, which was something she valued about him more than she could easily say. She said, "What I owe my mother is a stable home, a situation that is not dependent on the patience of my brother's wife." Timothy said, "What would that require?" She said, "Money, a place of her own, or a situation in which she could live with someone who actually wants her there." She paused. "I had thought if I saved enough from teaching placements, I might be able to set her up in a small boarding arrangement of her own, something with good people, somewhere she felt at home." He said, quietly, "Wyoming has good people." She looked at him sideways. He looked straight ahead at the road and said nothing more, and she let it sit there between them like a stone in a stream, the water going around it. The last day of school was a Friday in the last week of June, and the whole town seemed to know that their temporary teacher was leaving the following Monday, because the parents had organized a small celebration, gathering in the schoolhouse after lessons with apple cider and shortbread and a great deal of warm, slightly overwhelming gratitude. Rosa Mendez, the brilliant 14-year-old, had made a card signed by every student, even Peter, the weeping 6-year-old, who had apparently stopped weeping sometime in May, and replaced it with a tendency to follow Charlotte around the classroom like a small, solemn shadow. Charlotte held the card and looked at all the small signatures and felt the particular heartbreak of the traveling teacher, the one she had felt twice before and had believed she was accustomed to, and found that she was not accustomed to it at all. Rosa pulled her aside near the end of the gathering and said, with the direct confidence of a young woman who had decided that politeness was less useful than truth, "Miss Rourke, are you really going?" Charlotte said, "My contract ends Monday." Rosa said, "That is not what I asked." Charlotte looked at her for a moment and then said, "I have things I need to see to, people who need me." Rosa said, "There are people here who need you too." She said it without particular drama, simply as a statement of fact, and then she went back to the cider table and resumed a conversation with the Calloway twins, as if she had not just delivered the most accurate possible summary of Charlotte's entire problem. Timothy came to collect her at the end of the gathering, as he always did on the days they rode together, and she came out of the schoolhouse to find him waiting with patience already saddled, leaning against the fence post with his hat brim pulled against the late afternoon sun, and the sight of him standing there so exactly as he always stood, so precisely himself, hit her with a force she was not braced for. On the ride home she told him about Rosa. He listened and then said, smiling just slightly at the corner of his mouth, "She is going to be formidable." Charlotte said, "She already is." He said, "What will happen to her schooling when the regular teacher comes back?" Charlotte had been thinking about this. Agnes Fitch was a competent woman and a decent teacher, but she was not particularly interested in challenging students who were already ahead of the class, and Rosa needed challenging. Charlotte had spent the last week writing detailed notes about each student to leave for Agnes, and Rosa's notes were 3 pages long and included specific book recommendations and suggestions for independent assignments that would keep her engaged and growing. It was, Charlotte knew, the best she could do from a distance. He said, "You worry about them." She said, "Yes." He said, "That is why you are good at it." They rode the rest of the way in silence, and when they reached the ranch yard and she dismounted and handed Patience's reins to him, their hands overlapped briefly on the leather and neither of them moved for a moment, And then she looked up at him, and he was looking at her with that direct, unhurried look that she had long since stopped being able to interpret as anything other than exactly what it was. She said, "I leave Monday." He said, "I know," she said. "I am not promising anything." He said, "I know that too," she said. "You could write to me." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Would you read it?" She said, "Timothy, I have been living in your house for 3 months, and I read your letter to a land broker. Yes, I would read it." Something shifted in his face then, something that was not quite a smile and not quite relief but contained elements of both, and he said, "Then I will write." Sunday, the day before she was to leave, she found him out by the eastern fence in the late morning, standing among the 3 cottonwood trees that Ellen had planted. The trees were fully leafed out in the summer heat, their leaves shaking in the constant Wyoming breeze with a sound like soft applause, and he was standing looking at the 40 acres beyond the fence, the acres with the creek and the clearing. She went and stood beside him, and they both looked at the land for a while. She said, "It is beautiful." He said, "Yes," she said, "you really intended to build something out there." He said, "I still intend to," she said, "even if I don't come back." He said after a pause, "I think I would still build it, but it would not be for the same reason." She thought about that. Then she said, "What reason would it be?" He said, "Hope, I suppose. That if I build it, there is something to come back to. If you decide to." She turned and looked at him fully. This man who was so utterly without pretense, who had made the error of planning her future without her permission, and had owned it completely, and had simply waited with a patience that matched his mare's name. She thought about Denver and her mother and the life that was waiting for her. She thought about Rosa and Peter and the 22 signatures on the card in her trunk. She thought about the lamp left on in the hallway and the book delivered without comment and the hand steady on her elbow in the storm. She said, "When you write, tell me about the land. Tell me about the creek and what the cottonwoods look like in different light." He said, "I will." She said, "Tell me about the cattle and Patience and Ruff and whether Cal and Ned Prout behave themselves." He said, "They never entirely do, but I will tell you," she said, "and tell me what you are reading." He said, "Charlotte," she said. "What?" He said, "I am going to tell you all of it. I am going to tell you every small thing, because I want you to be able to close your eyes and see this place and know that it is still here." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, very quietly, "That is either the most wonderful thing anyone has ever said to me or an extremely sophisticated form of manipulation." He said, still completely straight-faced, "I am a cattle rancher. I do not have the capacity for sophisticated manipulation." She laughed, the same real laugh that had startled the room during the snowstorm card game, and he smiled, and for just a moment the whole complicated future and the whole impossible present collapsed into simply the two of them standing in the shade of Ellen's cottonwood trees on a summer morning in Wyoming with the creek running somewhere beyond the fence. She left Monday morning on the 6 o'clock train. Timothy drove her to the depot in the wagon, her trunk in the back, and they rode into town in the early light saying less than they usually did, which was already not very much. He helped her with her trunk and waited with her on the platform while the locomotive hissed and exhaled great white clouds into the July air, and when the conductor called for boarding, he picked up her travel bag and handed it to her, and then he looked at her and said, "Safe travels, Miss Rourke." She had been called Miss Rourke by every parent and most of the children for 3 months, and it had never done anything particular to her. He said it, and something in her chest clenched hard. She said, "Goodbye, Mr. Warren." She got on the train. She did not look back through the window because she was not sure she could afford to. She looked forward at the seat back in front of her and listened to the station sounds diminishing as the train began to move. And then she thought, "Oh, this is a very large problem," and she pressed her fingers against the window glass and watched Wyoming recede. Denver in July was hot and busy and full of people moving quickly in all directions, and after 3 months in Laramie it felt, in some way she could not entirely account for, too much. She arrived at Michael's house in the early evening and found her mother sitting on the porch in a rocking chair, and Frances Rourke looked smaller than Charlotte remembered, but her eyes were the same as they had always been, dark and sharp and full of the wry intelligence that Charlotte had inherited, and that had gotten her into various kinds of trouble her entire life. Frances looked at her for a long moment after the initial embrace and then said, "You look different," Charlotte said. "I have been outdoors a great deal." Frances said, "That is not what I mean, and you know it." Charlotte stayed for a week. She spent her days with her mother, walking slowly along the tree-shaded street in front of Michael's house, sitting on the porch in the afternoons, playing cards in the evenings. She assessed her mother's situation with the same thorough care she brought to everything. Michael was kind, genuinely so. Deborah was civil, which was about as far as it went. The house was comfortable enough, but the atmosphere was managed, in the way that things are managed when one person in a household is merely tolerated rather than wanted. Frances, who had managed a boarding house for 20 years and was therefore an expert in reading the social temperatures of shared domestic spaces, was not fooled by any of it. She was not unhappy, exactly, but she was not at home. On the 5th day, Charlotte sat down with her mother in the back garden away from the house and told her about Laramie. She had not planned to do this. She had planned to speak practically about finances and arrangements. But her mother was looking at her with those dark, intelligent eyes, and she simply began talking. And once she started, she did not stop. She told her about the spare room with the east-facing window, about the 22 children, about the snowstorm and the card game and the book left beside her coffee cup and the hand in the storm. She told her about the letter to the land broker and the conversation across the kitchen table and the cottonwood trees, and what Timothy had said about building something that would be there to come back to. When she finished, Frances was quiet for a moment and then said, "What is the question you are actually asking me?" Charlotte said, "I need to know what you need. I need to know what would make you all right, genuinely, before I can think about anything else." Frances said, "What I need is not to feel like a burden. What I need is to be somewhere I am wanted." Charlotte said, "I know." Frances said, "What does Wyoming look like?" Charlotte blinked. Then she said, "Wide, very wide. The sky is extraordinary." Frances said, "Is it good land?" Charlotte said, "The ranch is. The creek plot is beautiful." Frances looked at her daughter for a long moment with the expression of a woman who has lived long enough to recognize the particular quality of a love that a person is trying very hard not to admit to. Then she said, "Charlotte Ann Rourke, do not let yourself be a fool out of pride." Charlotte spent the second half of the week in Denver seeing to practical matters, visiting the savings bank where she kept her funds, calculating what she had, calculating what a stable arrangement for her mother would require. She wrote 3 letters, one to Michael, formally and carefully, about what she was considering and what it would mean for the question of their mother's care. One to Deacon Foss on the school board in Laramie, asking a careful and not entirely transparent question about whether there might be a permanent teaching position available if the board were ever to consider expanding. One to Timothy Warren. To Timothy she wrote, "I am in Denver. My mother is well enough, though not entirely what I would wish. I have been thinking about creek plots and cottonwood clearings. I have been thinking about what you said on the last ride home, about still building something even if I do not come back, because hope is its own reason. I would like to tell you that the kind of man who says a thing like that is not making the argument easy to resist. I am not promising anything, but I am thinking. I wanted you to know I am thinking." She sealed it and posted it, and then stood on the sidewalk outside the post office in the Denver heat and thought, well, that was either brave or catastrophically stupid, and walked back to Michael's house. His reply came in 9 days, which was faster than she had expected given the distance, and she understood when she saw how thick the envelope was that he had written it quickly and repeatedly revised it. He wrote, "The creek is running fast this week from the rain. The cottonwoods are making the sound they make in the breeze, the one that is different from all other sounds, and I have been thinking about trying to describe it to you, and finding that language is insufficient. The cattle are doing well." Cal Prout has developed an inexplicable feud with the rooster, which I am choosing not to investigate. I am reading a history of the fur trade, which sounds dry but is not. The land broker wrote again about the Eastern 40. I have not responded yet. I find I am waiting. I'm not a man who waits easily, you should know this. But for certain things, waiting seems the only correct approach. I hope your mother is well. I hope Denver is treating you gently. I hope you are not resisting the thinking you mentioned, because the thinking seems to me to be pointing somewhere worth going. Yours, Timothy Warren, yours. She read the letter 3 times in her room at Michael's house and then folded it and put it in her travel bag next to the card from the children. And then she went and knocked on her mother's door and said, "I am going back." Frances said, "I know." Charlotte said, "I want to take you with me. Not immediately, not before I know what there is to go back to. But I want you to come eventually, if I am right about what is there." Frances said, "Tell me what you need to do first." Charlotte said, "I need to go back to Laramie and have an honest conversation with a very stubborn, very quiet man who builds things without asking permission and then looks at you as if he has been waiting for you his entire life." Frances said, "That sounds like a man worth an honest conversation." Charlotte left Denver on the first Saturday of August on the morning train north, her trunk in the baggage car and her heart doing something she had long since given up trying to describe as anything other than terrified and certain in equal measure. She had not written to tell him she was coming. She was not sure why. Perhaps because she did not want the letter to arrive before she did. Perhaps because she wanted to see his face without the preparation of warning. The train pulled into Laramie in the late afternoon, the summer light already going golden and long across the plain, and she stepped down onto the platform with her bag and looked around the familiar station and felt, with a clarity that surprised her, that she was home. She hired a man with a cart to take her trunk and walked the 3 miles to the broken spur herself, because it was a beautiful evening and because she needed the time. And because she had walked this road enough times that her feet knew it even in the early evening light. She came over the rise that looked down into the ranch yard just as the last of the day's work was ending. The horses turned out to the small pasture, smoke beginning to rise from the kitchen chimney, the whole scene quiet and particular and golden in the late sun. She stood on the rise for a moment and looked at it. He came out of the barn. He stopped when he saw her. He stood in the yard with his hat in one hand and the evening light on his face, and she walked down the slope toward him, and he did not move, just watched her come. And when she was close enough to see his expression clearly, she could see that it was not surprise, not exactly, but something closer to a man who has been told that the thing he has hoped for might happen, and has then spent a long time holding himself very carefully so as not to spill the hope, and who is now watching it actually happen and does not quite know where to put his hands. She stopped a few feet from him and said, "I am here." He said, "Yes," she said, "I have not made any decisions. I am here to make them." He said, "That is all I could ask." She said, "I need you to show me the Eastern 40. He said, "Now," she said, "it is a fine evening." He put his hat back on his head, and they walked together to the eastern fence, through the gate and onto the 40 acres, into the long grass with the creek sound growing louder as they went, and the cottonwood clearing opened up before them in the last of the light, the trees taller than she had imagined, the creek running quick and clear over round stones, the clearing itself a perfect sheltered bowl of ground with the grass close cropped by the deer that came through. It was exactly as beautiful as the letter had made it sound. It was more beautiful. She stood in the middle of the clearing and turned slowly, looking at all of it. He stood a few feet away, watching her. She said, "Ask me." He said, "What?" She said, "You said that if I came back you would ask me every step of the way, so ask." A long pause. The creek ran. The cottonwood leaves made their particular sound. He said, "Charlotte, would you consider staying?" She said, "Yes." He said, "For longer than a season?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Would you consider building something here?" "Not the cottage, not yet. I mean something between us. Would you consider that?" She said, "Timothy Warren." I got on a train from Denver with no letter of warning because I did not want to wait long enough to write one. I think we are past the considering stage." He crossed the space between them in 2 steps, and she went up toward him in the same motion, and when he kissed her it was exactly like him, unhurried and certain, and completely without performance, the kind of kiss that does not need to announce itself because it already knows what it is. They stood in the cottonwood clearing in the Wyoming dusk for a long time, and the creek ran and the leaves moved, and the stars began to come out one at a time in the enormous sky overhead, and Charlotte thought about the word temporary and found that it no longer applied to anything in her immediate vicinity. The following weeks were a recalibration of everything. She was not the teacher anymore, not the temporary boarder, not the woman with a train ticket waiting. She was something that did not have a clean name yet, which was uncomfortable in its way, but she was becoming accustomed to the discomfort, finding it less frightening than it once had been. She wrote to the school board. Deacon Foss replied almost immediately with the news that the board had in fact been considering the question of expanding, that Agnes Fitch had made it quietly known. She was not planning to return to teaching now that her leg was healed, having found the convalescence rather peaceful and being of an age where peaceful was increasingly appealing. The board would be honored to discuss a permanent arrangement with Miss Rourke, should she be interested. She was interested. She wrote to Gerald Holt in Cheyenne. She told him that the Eastern 40 should proceed, that the buyer's plans had been confirmed by all relevant parties, and that he should expect a letter from Mr. Warren directly. Then she went and found Timothy in the barn and told him to write to Gerald Holt. He looked at her. She said, "The land is worth buying, the creek is worth having, and a kitchen garden would be an extremely practical addition to this operation." He said, "You spoke to the land broker." She said, "I wrote to him, on your behalf. You can be annoyed about it or you can write your own letter." He looked at her for another moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved in that particular way that was his version of a large smile, and he said, "I will write my own letter." She said, "Good." He said, "Charlotte." She said, "What?" He said, "I am glad you came back." She said, "I know you are. Now write to Gerald Holt." He wrote to Gerald Holt. The Eastern 40 acres were purchased by the end of August, the deed in Timothy Warren's name, the transaction completed with the clean finality of paper and seal. And afterward they rode out together to the creek plot and walked the boundaries, and he showed her where the natural break in the land would make the best foundation for the cottage. And she told him she wanted the kitchen garden on the south-facing slope where the sun would be longest. And they stood in the clearing while he described exactly how he imagined it, and she occasionally redirected him on specifics. And it was one of the most satisfying conversations she had ever had in her life. In September, she sent for her mother. The letter to Frances was long and detailed and honest about everything, about what her life at the Broken Spur had become, and what she hoped it was moving toward, about the school and the community and the land and the man who had written to land brokers on the basis of hope rather than certainty. She told her mother that there was a room that would be hers, and a community that was warm, and a grandson figure named Peter who had stopped crying and might, Charlotte thought, take very well to a grandmother figure of Frances's particular caliber. Frances wrote back by return mail and said she would be on the September train. Timothy, when informed, had not blinked. He had simply gone up to the room that had been Charlotte's teaching room before she moved into the larger one and spent 2 evenings making it right, carrying up a better chair, checking the stovepipe, making sure the window latch worked smoothly. Charlotte came in on the second evening and watched him from the doorway and felt something enormous and quiet happening in her chest. She said, "You do not have to do all of this." He said, "I know." She said, "She is not your responsibility." He said, "She is yours. That makes her mine as well." She crossed the room and took the window latch out of his hand and set it down on the sill, and then she put her arms around him, which startled him briefly because he was a man who was not accustomed to being embraced. And then his arms came around her and he held on, and she said into his shoulder, "You are an extraordinary person, Timothy Warren." He said into her hair, "I am a cattle rancher." She said, "Stop saying that." He said, "I cannot think of a better response." She laughed and held on, and the Wyoming autumn came through the window, cool and clean and smelling of dry grass and coming winter. And she thought about how nothing in her life had gone according to the plan she had carried into the Laramie depot in March, and how entirely fine that was. Frances Rourke arrived on the September 20th train, smaller than Charlotte had last seen her but sharp-eyed and observant, assessing the wagon and the wide road south, and the ranch when it came into view with the comprehensive efficiency of a boarding house manager evaluating a property. She met Timothy in the ranch yard and shook his hand and looked at him for a long moment and then said, "Charlotte tells me you built a writing desk for her room before she arrived." Timothy said, "Yes, ma'am," Frances said, "and that you wrote to a land broker about a cottage based entirely on hope." Timothy said, "Yes, ma'am," Frances said, "you are either very romantic or very presumptuous." Timothy said, "I have been told both." Frances considered this. Then she said, "Well, I suppose at least you are honest about it. Show me this kitchen garden plot you are planning." Charlotte, standing slightly behind and to the left, made no attempt to contain her smile. Frances adapted to life at the broken spur with a pragmatic ease that should not have surprised Charlotte but did. She found the Wyoming air invigorating, she said, which her Denver doctor had not predicted, and which seemed to be genuine rather than polite. She found the ranch's rhythms agreeable. She found Cal Pruitt's rooster feud hilarious. She took to sitting on the porch in the mornings with her coffee in a way that suggested the porch had been waiting for her. More importantly, she and Timothy established a mutual respect within approximately 48 hours that Charlotte had not orchestrated and did not take credit for. It was simply two people recognizing in each other a shared quality, a directness, a preference for doing over talking, a fundamental honesty that did not require social performance. They were alike in ways that made Charlotte feel that she had not moved her mother to a strange place, but had, somehow, moved her toward familiar company. The question of Charlotte and Timothy's future came to a formal head on a cold evening in October, with the first real frost on the grass and the fire going in the main room. Frances tactfully absent and very likely not asleep, with Patience and Ruff visible through the window standing quiet in the pasture under a sky absolutely crowded with stars. Timothy had built the fire up and then stood looking at it for a while in a way that Charlotte recognized as the look of a man composing something, and then he turned around and said, without preamble, as was his way, "I would like to ask you to marry me." She said, "I know." He said, "Is that yes?" She said, "I am thinking about whether it seems like a reasonable proposition." He said, "And," she said, "it seems like an extremely reasonable proposition." "Yes." He crossed the room and she stood up from the chair and he took her hands in both of his and stood looking at her with the expression she had come to love best, the one that was completely unguarded, entirely present, and said without any words at all that she was the thing he had been waiting for without knowing he was waiting. He said, "I do not have a ring yet." She said, "I am not particularly concerned about a ring." He said, "I will get one." She said, "Timothy." He said, "What?" She said, "Kiss me and stop worrying about the ring." He did both, eventually in the correct order. They were married in the Laramie church on the 14th of November, 1882, on a day that was cold and bright with a particular November light that made everything look slightly more vivid than usual, as if the world were putting in extra effort. The church was small, and the congregation was everyone Charlotte had come to know in her months in Laramie. Deacon Foss and the school board members and the parents of her students and the students themselves, including Rosa Mendez, who sat in the front row and watched the proceedings with an air of complete satisfaction, and Peter, now 7 years old and not crying even slightly, who had attached himself to Frances Rourke's side and showed every sign of staying there permanently. Cal and Ned Pruitt came in their cleanest clothes and behaved with almost painful respectability throughout the ceremony. Gerald Holt had not been invited, but had sent a letter of congratulations when word somehow reached Cheyenne, which Charlotte found both touching and slightly suspicious. Timothy Warren stood at the front of the church in his good dark coat and watched Charlotte walk toward him, and his face did the thing she loved, went completely and entirely open, unguarded, present, as if she were the only thing in the world worth looking at. And she thought, standing in the middle of the small aisle with the morning light coming through the church's single-stained window and painting everything amber and rose, that she had come to Laramie for a season, and it had turned out that she had come simply and entirely home. The minister said the words, and they said the words back, and Timothy put on her finger a simple gold band that he had ordered from the jeweler in Cheyenne 6 weeks ago, with a care and deliberateness that she had expected, because he did everything with care and deliberateness. And she thought about how she had come to love that about him most, that quality of intentionality, the way nothing he did was careless or accidental. When the minister told him he could kiss his bride, he did, and the church made a collective warm sound, and Frances Rourke dabbed at her eyes with her handkerchief, and then immediately looked around as if checking whether anyone had seen her, and decided they had and did not particularly care. The winter of 1882 into 1883 was a good one, by Wyoming standards, which meant it was severe but not catastrophic, the cold coming in deep and staying, but without the brutal blizzards that could devastate a cattle operation. Timothy and Charlotte worked the ranch together through the cold months with the comfortable efficiency of two people who have learned to occupy the same space without friction, their particular competencies fitting together in ways that neither had quite planned for but both appreciated. She managed the household accounts with a schoolteacher's precision for numbers, and caught an error in the summer tallying that had been costing them a small but consistent amount for 2 years. He reinforced the root cellar and the barn with a thoroughness that meant they lost no animals to the cold, which was more than most of the neighboring operations could say. Frances kept the house running with quiet authority. She had opinions about the kitchen organization that she expressed diplomatically but consistently, until things were arranged to her satisfaction, and the result was a kitchen that functioned significantly better than it had before, a fact that Timothy acknowledged without resentment, and Charlotte considered one of the finer diplomatic achievements of the season. Peter, the 7-year-old from Charlotte's class, had by November become a weekly presence at the ranch, his mother having discovered that he was both calmer and more talkative after his time at the Broken Spur than at any other point in the week. Frances had become, without anyone formally arranging it, something between a grandmother and a tutor to him. She taught him to play checkers and read aloud to him from the books on the parlor shelf, and he sat with her on the porch and watched the winter sky with the focused seriousness of a small person who had decided that the world was more interesting than it had first appeared. In March of 1883, Charlotte told Timothy she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen on a Sunday morning while the coffee was on, because she was not a woman who staged important announcements, and the kitchen seemed as good a place as any. He had set down his cup very carefully and then looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something wholly unguarded and enormous, and then he had crossed the kitchen in 2 steps and put his arms around her and held on in the way he had in the room when she had told him he was extraordinary, with a completeness that said everything he did not have words for. Frances, when informed, said, "I knew something was different about you," Charlotte said. "You have been here 3 days." Frances said, "I am your mother. I notice things." The Broken Spur prepared for its expansion with the same practical energy that characterized everything Timothy Warren undertook. The construction on the Eastern 40 began in May, the cottage frame going up over 2 weeks with the help of a carpenter from town and the Prout brothers and several neighboring ranchers who showed up with tools and opinions, and were managed by Timothy with a patient authority that Charlotte watched with deep affection. The kitchen garden went in on the south slope as she had specified, the beds dug, and prepared with a care that she suspected had less to do with gardening technique and more to do with Timothy's particular way of doing things properly. She planted it on a warm May afternoon, her hands in the Wyoming soil, her mother bringing seeds out in the paper packets they had ordered from a catalog in February. And she thought about the letter she had found under the floorboard in the study nearly a year ago, and how everything in it had come to pass, not because she had been trapped by it or maneuvered by it, but because she had made the choices that led her here herself, every one of them at every step. That was the thing about Timothy Warren's hidden plans. They had not in the end decided anything for her. They had simply been evidence, clumsily and secretly offered, of how much he hoped. And she had taken that evidence and weighed it against everything she knew about herself and her life, and what she wanted it to be, and she had chosen freely. Their son was born on a cold, clear evening in November of 1883, in the bedroom with the east-facing window, with a midwife from town named Mrs. Garrett in attendance, and Frances holding Charlotte's hand with a grip that was steady and sure and warm. Timothy sat outside the door for 3 hours in the manner of fathers who have been firmly and kindly told to stay out of the way, and when Mrs. Garrett opened the door and told him to come in, he walked to the bed and looked at Charlotte and then at the small, ferociously alive person she was holding, and his face did the thing again, the open, enormous, unguarded thing, and he sat on the edge of the bed and put his large, careful hand very gently on the baby's head and said nothing for a long time. Charlotte said, "He looks like you." Timothy said, "He looks like someone who is going to have opinions." Charlotte said, "He will get that from both sides." They named him James after Timothy's father, who had died before Timothy bought the ranch, and Frances declared him the finest-looking baby in Wyoming territory, with the authority of a woman who had opinions about most things and was not shy about them. Cal Prout, who came to see the baby with Ned and held him with the extreme caution of a large man handling something delicate and precious, announced that the rooster had seemed celebratory that morning, which everyone took as the endorsement it was meant to be. The years at the Broken Spur settled into a rhythm that was full and purposeful and deeply, quietly good. Charlotte's permanent teaching position at the Laramie schoolhouse gave her days a structure and a purpose that she had always needed, the school growing under her tenure from 22 students to 31, as more families settled the surrounding territory. The classroom expanding when the board finally approved the addition that Charlotte had been arguing for since 1883. Rosa Mendez became exactly as formidable as promised, completing her studies early and going on to a women's college in the East on a scholarship that Charlotte had spent 6 months researching and writing letters to facilitate. And the letter Rosa sent from her first week, there was something Charlotte kept, like the children's card, in her travel bag for the rest of her life. Frances lived at the Broken Spur until the spring of 1885, when her heart, which had held on so much longer than anyone had predicted in the clear Wyoming air, finally let go on a quiet morning, sitting in her chair on the porch with her coffee and the view of the mountains. She went peacefully, which was what she had wanted, and she went at home, which was what Charlotte had needed for her, and Timothy built her marker himself from a piece of good Wyoming stone and set it under the cottonwoods where the shade was deep and pleasant and the creek sound carried on the air. Peter, now 10 years old and no longer the weeping 6-year-old he had been, wept again at the service, but this time for genuine and understood reasons, and Charlotte held his hand throughout, and Timothy stood at her other side, and the community of Laramie gathered under the cottonwood trees on the eastern 40, and said goodbye to a woman who had come late to Wyoming, and had, by all accounts, thoroughly approved of it. James Warren grew up on the Broken Spur with the particular confidence of a child who has been wanted and planned for and loved from before his existence was certain, running the fence lines and knowing the names of every horse and growing brown and tall, and opinionated in the way his parents had predicted from his first week of life. By the time he was 3 years old, his father was already teaching him the names of the cattle and the proper technique for mending a fence post, and his mother was already reading to him every evening from the books on the parlor shelf. And he was going to be, Charlotte thought, watching him run across the yard one summer afternoon with the Wyoming sky enormous and blue above him. Exactly fine. Their daughter, Eleanor, arrived in the summer of 1886, born in the same east-facing room with Mrs. Garrett still presiding over the proceedings with her characteristic calm competence. And this time Timothy was quicker to come through the door and more certain in his manner when he sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his daughter, as if the second time around he knew exactly where to put the enormous feeling. James, who had recently turned 2 and was in the adjacent room in the care of the Prout brothers, could be heard through the wall rendering his opinion of the situation in a series of determined and varied vocalizations that said quite clearly he was not certain about the new development, which Mrs. Garrett said was entirely normal, and which resolved itself within a week into James deciding that Eleanor was in fact an acceptable addition, and that he would personally take responsibility for her education in the important matters of fence climbing and horse naming. The Eastern 40 filled in beautifully over the years. The kitchen garden expanded beyond its original beds, becoming an enterprise of genuine productivity, supplying not just the ranch household but contributing regularly to the community suppers that the church organized in the cold months. The cottage, when it was finally built to its completion in the spring of 1884, was exactly what Timothy had described to the land broker in that secret letter, modest in size, and built with the precision that characterized everything he made, with a sitting room that caught the afternoon light and a front porch that faced the creek, and a kitchen that Charlotte had designed herself with the specific lessons of the main house's kitchen in mind. They used it for guests, for the ranch hands during busy seasons, for the odd traveler that the road brought through, and it was always clean and ready because Timothy maintained it with the same regular attention he brought to everything. Charlotte and Timothy themselves lived in the main house, which expanded incrementally over the years as the ranch prospered, a room added here and a porch extended there, the whole structure growing with the quiet, organic logic of a thing that has taken root and is simply continuing to grow. The bookshelves in the parlor became 2 sets, then 3, and the titles on them told the history of the household's years together in a way that no other record could. Timothy's histories and accounts of the land alongside Charlotte's novels and teaching manuals, and the children's books that migrated from the shelves to the floor and back again, as James and Eleanor worked their way through them. There was a morning in the spring of 1887, 5 years after Charlotte had first arrived on the Laramie train with her trunk and her plans for a single season, when she woke early, before Timothy, which was unusual because he rose with the light as a matter of habitual practice. She got up quietly and dressed and went out through the kitchen and across the yard and through the gate to the Eastern 40, walking in the cool spring dawn with the dew on the grass soaking her boots and the creek running loud and clear in the early silence. She stood in the cottonwood clearing and looked at the trees, which were enormous now, 5 years of Wyoming growth making them tall and spreading and full of the particular sound that Timothy had written about in his letter, the sound that was different from all other sounds, the one that language was insufficient to describe. She stood there for a long time. She heard him coming before she saw him, the familiar sound of his step in the grass, and then he came through the cottonwood stand and stopped when he saw her, and he was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which said everything about the kind of man he was and had always been. He came and stood beside her and handed her a cup, and they stood together in the clearing with the spring morning coming on around them, the light growing in the east over the mountains, the creek running, the cottonwood leaves beginning to move in the first of the morning breeze. He said, "What are you thinking about?" she said. "March of 1882. He said, "Arriving," she said, "the floorboard, the letter." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I am still not entirely sorry about the letter." She said, "I know you are not." He said, "It worked out." She said, "That is your defense, it worked out." He said with the absolute straight-faced delivery that she had been unable to resist for 5 years, "I am a cattle rancher. My defenses are practical." She put her hand around his arm and leaned against his shoulder, and he stood steady and warm against the spring morning as he always had, as she had come to know he always would. She said, "I came here for a season." He said, "Yes." She said, "And you began planning for much longer." He said, "Yes." She said, "That was either very wise or very presumptuous." He said, "I believe we established that it was both." She said, She looked up at the sky, which was beginning to go gold at the edges where the sun was coming. She said, "Timothy." He said, "What?" She said, "Thank you for planning for much longer." He looked down at her with the unguarded, open, entirely present expression that had been hers from the beginning, and that she had come to understand was the most valuable thing she owned, and he said, "Thank you for coming back." They stood in the clearing under the cottonwood trees that Ellen had planted, which had grown tall and true and outlasted the grief that had surrounded them. And the sun came up over the Wyoming mountains, and the creek ran on, and the morning birds started their business in the branches above, and the broken spur came alive around them the way it did every morning, smoke from the kitchen chimney, the sound of James's voice already carrying from the house, the horses moving in the pasture. The life was all there, waiting, the same as it had been every morning, full and real, and built from the ground up on honesty and choice, and the stubborn, patient hope of a man who had quietly begun planning for much longer and a woman who had been brave enough to come back and claim what he had been building. She finished her coffee and handed him the cup and said, "I should go start breakfast." He said, "James is probably already in the kitchen." She said, "Then he is already in the bread." He said, "Almost certainly." She started back toward the gate and he walked beside her, and Alina's voice joined James's from somewhere inside the house, and the morning was fully begun. In the autumn of 1888, Charlotte was appointed the lead teacher and administrator of the expanded Laramie schoolhouse, a position that had not previously existed, and that the board created specifically, because it had become obvious to everyone involved that what Charlotte Rourke Warren had built in 6 years was something the school board should probably try to keep. She accepted with the condition that she be allowed to continue developing an advanced curriculum for students like Rosa, students who outgrew what a frontier school could normally offer, and the board, who had learned that conditions put forward by Charlotte Rourke Warren were generally worth agreeing to, agreed. She wrote to Rosa in the East to tell her, and Rosa wrote back immediately with congratulations, and the news that she was planning to become an attorney, which Charlotte received with approximately zero surprise and enormous pride. The broken spur itself had grown by then from its original holdings to include not only the eastern 40, but 2 additional parcels that Timothy had acquired with the careful, considered patience he brought to everything, expanding the cattle operation in the sustainable, methodical way that had become the broken spur's reputation in the territory. He was known in Laramie as a square dealer, a man whose word was as reliable as his fence lines, and the neighboring ranchers who had watched him work alone for years had come, through the accumulation of consistent, honest dealings, to consider him something between a colleague and a friend, which was the closest most of them got to the word. Cal Prout married a woman named Harriet in 1885 and settled on a small parcel 2 miles west, and he still worked for Timothy in the busy seasons, bringing Harriet along sometimes. And Harriet and Charlotte had developed the particular friendship of women who share a landscape and a frank manner of speaking, and a deep mutual exasperation at the theatrical tendencies of men who will not simply say what they mean. Ned Prout had gone north to Montana, drawn by the gold talk, and came back 2 years later with no gold and a great many stories, and resumed his place in the seasonal work, as if he had simply stepped out for an extended lunch. The rooster died peacefully in 1886 at an age that suggested it had been sustained entirely by spite, and Cal Prout attended its departure with a solemnity that everyone agreed was excessive, but no one questioned because he had, after all, been fighting this battle for years and deserved his moment. By the time James was 6 and Eleanor was 3, the broken spur was something that Charlotte had not entirely envisioned that night she had lain awake thinking about the letter, but that felt, when she looked at it whole, precisely and inevitably right. It was a place that had been built by two people who had chosen each other with full information and clear eyes, a place where work and love and the particular satisfaction of a thing done well were the daily currency, where children grew up knowing the names of the cattle and the plot of their grandmother's favorite novels in equal measure. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Charlotte and Timothy sat on one side and the other of the fireplace in the main room, as they had in the very beginning, before any of it was decided or certain, before a single promise had been made or kept. He read his histories and his land surveys and the occasional novel she pressed on him with the determination of a woman who had decided his literary life required expansion. She graded papers and planned lessons, and sometimes simply sat and looked at the fire. Sometimes she looked at him. He always knew, in the way he had always known things about her without being told, and he would look up from his page and meet her eyes across the room, and the look between them was all the history of the past years compressed into a single moment of recognition. The March train and the snowstorm and the letter under the floorboard and the cleared table and the book by the coffee cup and the hand in the storm and the ride to the cottonwood clearing in the summer dusk and the words said across the kitchen table and the ring on her finger and the names of their children and the mornings. All of the mornings. The Wyoming sky outside the window was always doing something extraordinary. She had come for a season, and the rancher had quietly been planning for much longer, and together they had built something that neither the season nor the plans had been quite large enough to contain, something that required the full span of years and choice and morning coffee and honest conversation, and the particular kind of love that does not need to announce itself because it already knows what it is and simply goes on, patient and certain and present, like a creek running through a cottonwood clearing in the wide, clear, endlessly capacious heart of the Wyoming plain. She set down her grading and looked at the fire. He looked up from his book. She said, "I am glad I came back." He said, "I know," she said. "You do not have to say I told you so." He said, "I was not going to," she said. "You were thinking it." He said after a pause, "I was thinking it a little." She smiled and he smiled and the fire burned and the night was quiet and full and good, and outside the cottonwood trees on the eastern 40 stood tall in the dark Wyoming night, exactly as Ellen had believed they would, long after both of them, growing and present and there.